Greg Thompson was sitting in his modest Melbourne apartment, enjoying a quiet evening after a long day of work. As he sipped his beer, his phone buzzed, and he hoped it was a message from his daughter, Emily. It had been some time since they last spoke, and he was eager to hear how her wedding preparations were going. But instead of a text from Emily, it was a photo, an elegant wedding invitation. His heart sank as he saw it wasn't addressed to him, but had been posted on Emily's Instagram story. The invitation was beautiful, featuring gold script and delicate floral designs. The details were clear. Emily and Lucas are getting married on October 12th at Golden Hills Estate in Sydney. Tomorrow. Greg stared at the screen, feeling a sense of disbelief. He had known the wedding was coming up, but he convinced himself, no, he had hoped, that Emily might have forgotten to send him an invitation. She couldn't possibly exclude him from the most important day of her life. Could she? He began to scroll through the comment on the post, seeing congratulatory messages from old friends, family, and acquaintances, everyone seemingly to know about the wedding, except him. His heart pounded as frustration and confusion built within him. He picked up his phone again, dialing Emily's number, only to be met with voicemail after 2 rings. He tried again. Voicemail. He gripped the phone tightly, the anger swelling inside him. Then came a text message from his ex-wife, Sophie. Greg, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Emily made her choice. Please respect it. We don't need any drama tomorrow. Drama? Respect? Greg slammed the phone down, his mind racing with thoughts of Sophie and the man who had ruined their marriage, Dan Murray. Dan had always been around, a friend of family. But Greg had always felt something wasn't right. Now it was clear why. Sophie's affair with Dan had destroyed their marriage, and now Dan was going to be the one walking Emily down the aisle. His mind flashed back to the bitter divorce, to the betrayal he felt when Sophie had confessed the affair. The years that followed had been difficult, but he had hoped that Emily, his only child, would always be there for him. But now it seemed he had been replaced in her life. Greg remembered the happy times when he and Sophie had first met, young, hopeful, building a future together. But as Sophie's career took off, their relationship began to suffer. She became distant, focused more on her business trips and networking events. Greg tried to ignore the signs, the late nights, the texts, the way Sophie started dressing up more for work. It was only when he found the messages between Sophie and Dan that the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. When he confronted Sophie, she didn't deny it. Instead, she told him she hadn't been happy for years. That was the beginning of the end. After the divorce, Emily's life became split between Greg's modest apartment and Sophie's upscale home. Sophie's influence over Emily grew. It wasn't long before Greg felt like a distant memory in his daughter's life. Now, as Greg sat alone in his apartment, he could no longer ignore the pain. His heart ached with the thought that his daughter, the girl he had raised and loved unconditionally, had chosen to lead him out of her wedding. He wasn't going to let it go like this. He wasn't going to be sidelined in his daughter's life without a fight. Greg decided he was going to the wedding, whether they liked it or not. He put on his best suit, an old navy blue one that still fit well enough, and combed his hair. He didn't look the way he used to, the years of hardship showing, but there was still something left in him. He grabbed his car keys and drove the long distance to Golden Hills Estate, a vineyard outside Sydney where the wedding was being held. The drive gave him plenty of time to think, and by the time he arrived, his mind was a whirlwind. The estate was breathtaking, with rolling green hills, rows of grapevines stretching into the distance, and a white chapel at the center. It was exactly the kind of place Sophie would have chosen. Elegant, sophisticated, far removed from the simpler life Greg had imagined for Emily. He parked a short distance from the entrance and stood outside, taking the sounds of the wedding preparations. The music, the chatter of guests. He was uninvited, but it didn't matter. All he cared about now was Emily. Greg moved toward the ceremony area, staying just outside of the guests. He scanned the crowd, his eyes finally landing on Sophie, dressed in a designer gown, laughing with friends. Dan was standing beside her, his hand on her back, looking every bit the part of the confident man who had taken everything from Greg. And then he saw her, Emily, glowing in her wedding dress, talking to her bridesmaids. Greg's heart skipped a beat at the sight of her. It had been too long since he had seen his daughter, and in that moment he felt both a surge of love and a deep sorrow. He watched as Dan approached Emily, placing his hand on her shoulder. She smiled up at him, smiled the way she used to smile at Greg. And then it happened. The music shifted, and Emily linked her arm with Dan's, signaling the start of the ceremony. It was too much for Greg to bear. With a storm brewing inside him, Greg took a step forward, then another, moving toward the center of the ceremony space. The murmur of conversations fell into an uncomfortable silence as all eyes turned toward him. Sophie saw him first, her eyes widening in shock, and she whispered something to Dan, who turned around with a frown. The crowd began to stir, unsure of what was happening. Greg's presence was like a cold wind sweeping through the celebration. Sophie stepped toward him, her voice low and tense as she tried to control the situation. "Greg," she started, but Greg wasn't listening anymore. He had been silenced for too long. Emily, who had been focused on the ceremony, looked up and saw her father standing just a few feet away. Her face paled, and their eyes met. For a brief moment, it seemed like time stopped. Greg could see the guilt, the confusion, and maybe even a trace of regret in her expression. "Dad." Her voice was small, barely above a whisper, but it was enough. "Emily." Greg's voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, but soft enough to convey the years of pain he had carried. "I love you. I've always loved you, and I thought I was going to walk you down the aisle today." Sophie opened her mouth to interrupt, but Greg wasn't finished. "I don't know what happened between us, why you felt like you couldn't have me here, but I'm your father, and I've been there for you your whole life. I deserve to be a part of this day." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she looked from her father to Dan, who stood awkwardly in the background. "Dad," she whispered, trembling, "I didn't invite you because I thought it would be easier for everyone. Mom said it would be better this way, that it would be simpler." Greg shook his head, his voice soft but firm. "Easier for who? Emily, for you or for them?" His question hung in the air as Emily's face crumpled in sorrow. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." She sobbed, stepping toward him. Without another word, Emily rushed into Greg's arms, and he held her tight, tears falling from both of them as they embraced. The guests remained silent, watching the emotional reunion unfold. Sophie stood at a distance, her arms crossed, her face hard. Dan shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. But Greg wasn't there for him. He was there for Emily. "I'm sorry I didn't invite you, Dad," Emily whispered, still crying. "I thought you didn't want to be a part of my life anymore. I thought after the divorce, everything—" Greg pulled back slightly, looking her in the eyes. "How could you think that, sweetheart? You're my daughter. You've always been my everything." There was a brief pause before Emily spoke again, her voice cracking. "Will you still walk me down the aisle, Dad?" Greg's heart swelled with pride. "Of course I will." They linked arms, and together they began their walk down the aisle, the music swelling around them. It wasn't the way Greg had imagined, but it was real. When they reached the altar, Greg handed Emily over to Lucas, her fiancé, with a firm, heartfelt nod. "Take care of her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lucas nodded, understanding the gravity of Greg's words. Greg stepped back, taking a seat among the guests. He had fought for his place in his daughter's life, and in that moment he knew he had won. The reception was held under a large tent by the vineyard, and Greg watched from a distance as Emily laughed. Surrounded by friends and family, she was radiant, and for the first time in a long time, Greg felt peace. Sophie approached him, but Greg's attention remained on Emily, knowing that despite everything, he had his daughter back. Her face was tense with frustration as she muttered under her breath, "You just couldn't let it go, could you?" Her arms were crossed offensively as she shot him a glare. Greg turned to face her, his expression composed yet resolute. "This isn't about you, Sophie. It's about Emily. She needed her father today, and I wasn't going to fail her." Sophie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "She was fine without you." Greg shook his head, locking eyes with her. "No, she wasn't, and you know it too." There was a brief silence, and Sophie's gaze wavered. For once, her pride seemed to falter. But Greg wasn't about to let that moment slip away. He wasn't going to let her take what mattered most from him. Without saying another word, Sophie turned and walked away, her pride visibly bruised. Greg watched her leave, but there was no bitterness in him. He had won the only battle that truly mattered. Later, as the evening began to settle into a gentle calm and the reception slowed, Greg found himself standing at the edge of the dance floor. Emily approached him, her new husband by her side, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Dad," she said quietly, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you for being here, for everything." Greg smiled warmly, pulling her into an embrace. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything." They stood there, father and daughter, connected once again. In that moment, Greg knew that while things wouldn't be perfect, they could still rebuild. There were still many wounds to mend, many conversations left to be had. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for in years. Hope. Hope that the rift between him and Emily could heal, that their bond could grow even stronger. The night continued with Greg watching Emily and Lucas share their first dance as a married couple. As he sat at his table, his heart was full, lighter than it had been in years. He had lost so much over time, but tonight he had reclaimed something far more precious, his place in his daughter's life. As the music played on, Greg reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Life, with all its challenges, had a way of testing his strength, but it also had a way of showing that love, real unconditional love, would always find a way to break through.